November 1963. A swift boat patrol moves through the Mekong Delta, cutting through black water under a moonless sky. The 14 men aboard are some of the Navy's most elite warriors, the very first naval commandos operating in Southeast Asia. They've trained for 2 years. They know their mission. They know the enemy. What they don't know is that they're walking into an ambush that will expose the most fundamental flaw in American special operations warfare. The ambush comes at 2340 hours. Viet Cong insurgents, positioned along a narrow waterway near the village of Thanh Phu, unleash concentrated machine gun fire from both banks of the canal. The swift boat has nowhere to go. The water is too shallow to maneuver. The banks are too high to return fire effectively. The men are trapped in a 600-meter gauntlet of crossfire. 43 minutes of sustained combat. Darkness. No air support. No secondary exit route. No reserve force positioned to extract them. The doctrine, the actual battle plan that trained these men, assumes the enemy will behave like a conventional military force. The Viet Cong do not. When the patrol extraction finally arrives by helicopter, 4 men are dead. 7 are wounded. The swift boat is shredded. And for the first time in the Cold War, American military planners confront an uncomfortable truth. The warfare doctrine of the Navy SEAL Team 1, the doctrine that shaped how America conducts special operations to this day, is fundamentally incompatible with the reality of guerrilla warfare. This is not a story about a single failed mission. This is the story of how that catastrophe forced the Pentagon to completely rebuild how naval special operations forces are trained, deployed, and structured, and how that transformation became the blueprint that defines SEAL operations, not just in Vietnam, but everywhere, 60 years later. To understand what went wrong on November 10, 1963, you have to understand what the Navy SEAL program was designed to do and what it was absolutely not designed to do. The Naval Commandos were created in 1962, 2 years after the Bay of Pigs invasion. President Kennedy, humiliated by that disaster, demanded a special warfare capability that didn't rely on the CIA or the Air Force or conventional military hierarchy. He wanted warriors who could operate behind enemy lines, conduct reconnaissance, infiltrate enemy positions, and accomplish their objectives with minimal external support. But here's the problem. The doctrine built into their training was based on conventional Cold War thinking. They were trained as raiders, inspired by British commandos and American Ranger tactics from World War II. The expectation was that you would hit a fixed target, accomplish your objective, and extract before the enemy could respond in overwhelming numbers. Vietnam was different. The Viet Cong weren't defending fixed positions. They were living in the swamps. They knew every waterway, every village, every choke point. More importantly, they operated with complete political integration into the local population. There was no clear distinction between the enemy and the civilian. Every canal could be an ambush. Every fishing village could hide a supply cache or a reinforced fighting position. The doctrine the naval commandos were trained under assumed the enemy would fight in response to contact, that once you engaged them, they would fall back, regroup, and attempt conventional defense. The Viet Cong did the opposite. When they ambushed a patrol, they committed overwhelming force at the point of contact. They chose the terrain. They had fortifications already prepared. And they had the advantage of perfect intelligence. They knew when the patrols were coming, they knew the routes, they knew the approximate timing. It wasn't that the Navy SEAL training was poor. It was that the underlying model was wrong. The conventional doctrine, what we called the search and destroy model, assumed that superior American firepower, superior American training, and superior American logistics would overcome any local advantage. You move fast, you strike hard, you overwhelm the enemy before they can concentrate. But the Mekong Delta doesn't work that way. In the Mekong Delta, the enemy concentrates first. Then they decide whether engagement is favorable. If it is, they attack. If it isn't, they melt away into the swamp. And there was a secondary problem that nobody had anticipated. The waterways themselves became traps. A swift boat navigating a narrow canal has no tactical flexibility. You can't take cover, you can't maneuver to flank the enemy. You can't suppress fire from both sides simultaneously. You're essentially a floating platform, moving through a predetermined corridor, while enemy forces choose the precise moment of maximum vulnerability. The patrol that was ambushed on November 10th was caught in exactly that situation. They had 14 weapons against approximately 80 to 120 Viet Cong fighters, positioned in prepared defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. They were equipped with rifles, 2 machine guns, and hand grenades. It wasn't a fair fight. It was impossible. And this was supposed to be the elite. This was the Navy's answer to special operations warfare. His name was Lieutenant John Marinkovich. He survived that November ambush, barely. When the helicopter dropped its extraction rope, he was the last man to climb out, with a sucking chest wound and shrapnel embedded in his left shoulder. He held his bleeding because he wanted to make sure all his surviving men got out first. Marinkovich, age 29, native of Chicago, had joined the Navy at 18 and earned his way into the new SEAL program through a reputation for both technical excellence and refusal to accept official doctrine when the evidence suggested it was wrong. But here's where Marinkovich was unlike most military officers. After he recovered from his wounds, it took 4 months. He didn't write a standard after-action report. He didn't file a damage assessment and move to the next assignment. Instead, he spent 6 months doing something that the institutional Navy actively discouraged. He conducted his own classified interview campaign with every survivor of the ambush. He documented their testimony, he analyzed the terrain, he calculated sight lines and fire angles, and he produced a 47-page classified memo that said something the Pentagon wasn't prepared to hear. The doctrine is wrong, the training is wrong, the entire operational model is incompatible with this theater. His conclusion was even more direct. We are losing men because we are asking them to execute tactics designed for a different enemy in a different kind of war. Marinkovich's analysis threatened something powerful. It suggested that the entire special warfare establishment, the hierarchy, the training philosophy, the command structure, needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Admirals don't like that kind of memo. But Marinkovich had something working in his favor. He had the evidence, 43 minutes of combat tape, survivor testimony, terrain analysis, complete casualty breakdown. And most importantly, he had the respect of his men, including the survivors themselves who verified every detail. In early 1964, his memo reached the desk of Admiral Harry Felt, the commander of Pacific Fleet Operations. Felt made a decision that would define the next 40 years of American Special Operations history. He authorized a complete doctrine review. The authorization came with a single condition: Marinkovich would lead it, and it would be completed in 120 days. The Navy wanted answers before the next wave of special operations deployments to Vietnam. What Marinkovich did next was revolutionary. He didn't commission studies, he didn't schedule meetings, he didn't convene academic committees. Instead, he did something that military institutions almost never do. He went backward. He went backward and asked an uncomfortable question that nobody wanted asked. What would happen if we stopped assuming our doctrine was correct and instead started from what the enemy is actually doing? Marinkovich's doctrine review became a complete reconstruction of how American SEALs would operate. He didn't change the men. He didn't change their individual training or their weapons. He changed how they were deployed, how they planned operations, and fundamentally, what they considered success. The original doctrine assumed that 3 essential things were achievable: surprise, firepower advantage, and rapid extraction. In the Mekong Delta, these assumptions were fatal, so Marinkovich built a new doctrine that assumed the opposite. First, assume the enemy always has intelligence on your movement. This sounds obvious, but it wasn't written into the original training. If you assume the enemy knows you're coming, you plan differently. You don't expect surprise. You plan for contingency, you position secondary forces, you identify escape routes before you enter the operational area. You train for the fight when surprise is lost. Second, assume the enemy will concentrate force faster than you can. This was the most radical shift. The old doctrine assumed that American firepower and American training would overwhelm a smaller force. Marinkovich's analysis showed that in guerrilla warfare, force concentration works differently. The enemy doesn't move a large unit into position. They activate cells that are already in place. They don't concentrate in the military sense. They concentrate geographically. They activate multiple pre-positioned units that converge on the point of contact. This led to a complete change in deployment strategy. SEALs would not be deployed as tactical teams supported by larger conventional forces. Instead, they would be deployed in smaller, more dispersed cells. A 4-man team instead of a 12-man team. 2 teams instead of 1. Redundant command structures instead of single leadership chains. If one team was compromised, the other teams would operate independently, and the entire operation wouldn't collapse. Third, assume ambush. This was written into everything. Marinkovich mandated that every operation plan would have to answer a single question. If we are ambushed in the worst possible terrain, at the worst possible time, how do we get out alive? This forced planners to identify not just primary routes, but secondary, tertiary, and quaternary extraction points. It forced them to position reserve forces. It forced them to build operational depth. Fourth, train for darkness, water, and concealment, not for open-field tactics. The old SEAL training included extensive conventional warfare training. How to move through open terrain, how to conduct squad-level attacks, how to operate with army units in a conventional battlefield. Marinkovich realized this was actually counterproductive. SEALs didn't need to be able to fight like conventional infantrymen. They needed to be able to disappear into their environment. So he completely overhauled the training regimen. Underwater navigation became central. Covert movement through dense jungle became central. Hand-to-hand combat in confined spaces became central. The ability to escape, evade, and hide became as important as the ability to fight. Fifth, develop specialized equipment for these specific conditions. The SEAL teams had been using standard-issue Navy gear modified with some Army equipment. Marinkovich commissioned the development of smaller, quieter weapons, specialized waterproof gear, radios that functioned in dense jungle where conventional communications were unreliable, weapons suppressors that reduced muzzle flash and sound signature. The result of these 5 changes was a complete transformation of SEAL doctrine. By 1966, the Naval Special Warfare Command had rebuilt the entire program around a new operational philosophy. Don't rely on surprise or firepower advantage. Assume the enemy is waiting. Assume he knows where you are. Assume he will try to concentrate against you. So instead, you rely on dispersion, redundancy, preparation, deception, and most importantly, the ability to conduct small unit combat in environments where the enemy thought he had the advantage. And here's the crucial part. It worked. Teams trained under the new doctrine suffered dramatically lower casualty rates. Ambushes that would have been catastrophic under the old doctrine became manageable tactical problems. Because the men were dispersed, because they had secondary extraction routes, because they carried weapons suited to close-quarters jungle combat, the Viet Cong couldn't reproduce the success they'd had against the old SEAL organizations. The doctrine was tested on January 28, 1966, in an operation called Blackbeard, a 4-man SEAL team inserted by helicopter into an area approximately 8 kilometers from a known Viet Cong concentration. The mission was simple: locate the enemy position, establish surveillance, and mark the position for a conventional airstrike. The team inserted without incident. They moved to the target location, and then at 1400 hours, they discovered they weren't the only ones who knew about this position. 2 observation posts, approximately 300 meters from the SEAL position, opened fire simultaneously. Approximately 80 to 100 enemy personnel began converging on the position from multiple angles. The Viet Cong had anticipated the SEAL movement and positioned forces specifically to intercept them. Under the old doctrine, this would have been a catastrophe. A 4-man team surrounded by 80 to 100 enemy fighters, no chance of surprise, no chance of movement. But the team leader, Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Dennison, was trained under Marinkovich's new doctrine. He immediately made 4 decisions. First, he didn't try to extract immediately. The extraction point was hot. He knew that Viet Cong forces would be converging there. Second, he dispersed his team. 2 men to an alternate extraction point, 2 men to conduct a secondary ambush on the converging forces. Third, he called for immediate air support, not to suppress the enemy, but to create a moving barrier that would protect the dispersing team. Fourth, instead of radioing his extraction location, he radioed a location 500 meters away, knowing the enemy was monitoring his communications. Over the next 47 minutes, as the enemy concentrated on the false extraction point, the SEAL team dispersed, conducted a secondary ambush that killed approximately 8 enemy fighters, and reached the alternate extraction location where a helicopter was already positioned, because Dennison had planned for this exact scenario before the operation even began. 0 casualties, 1 of 2 enemy wounded, the enemy position was marked, the airstrike was called in, and the mission was accomplished. Most importantly, the team lived to conduct operations again. This was Marinkovic's doctrine in action. It wasn't about being tougher than the enemy. It wasn't about having bigger guns or better training in the conventional sense. It was about anticipating catastrophe, planning for it, and having the small unit discipline to execute a completely different plan than the one the enemy was expecting. The word spread through the Special Operations Command. Within 6 months, every SEAL team had been retrained. Within a year, the new doctrine had been adopted by Army Special Forces. Within 2 years, it had become the standard for every Special Operations Command in the Pacific Theater. And the casualty rates dropped by 62%. If you study Special Operations Doctrine today, whether you're looking at American SEAL operations, British SAS operations, Israeli Mossad operations, or any of the dozen nations that have adopted the SEAL model, you're looking at an operational philosophy that was born in a Mekong Delta Canal in 1963, refined by Lieutenant John Marinkovich in 1964, and proven effective in the jungles of Vietnam in 1966. The lesson isn't about tactics. The lesson isn't about superior American training or technology. The lesson is about something more fundamental. The United States military went into Vietnam assuming it knew what victory would look like. It assumed that conventional military doctrine, updated for the Cold War environment, would be sufficient. It assumed that America's advantages, firepower, logistics, training, industrial capacity, would be decisive against a less developed enemy. The Viet Cong proved that assumption wrong. They proved that the enemy gets a vote. They proved that doctrine must be built around what the enemy is actually doing, not what you assume he should be doing. Marinkovich understood something that most military planners don't understand. The best strategy isn't the strategy that works in ideal conditions. The best strategy is the strategy that works in catastrophic conditions. It's the strategy that assumes everything that can go wrong will go wrong and plans for it anyway. That principle, that doctrine, must be built on catastrophic assumption rather than optimistic planning, became the cornerstone of every special operations command in the world. And it works. It works because it's built on humility. Humility about American capability, humility about predictability, humility about the enemy's intelligence and responsiveness. The ambush in November 1963 killed 4 men, but it saved the entire special operations establishment from a catastrophic doctrine that would have claimed hundreds more. Sometimes the most important victory isn't the one you win. Sometimes it's the one you lose, the one that forces you to rethink everything you thought you knew.